today we have our brilliant poets going to talk about family history, like going to read their poems in relation to family history and also have a conversation together. So if I would just like to mention our moderator for tonight is Susheila, Professor Susheila Nasta. She is the founding editor of Wasafiri magazine, which was launched in 1984. Her own books include many important diasporic literature criticisms, home truths, fictions of the South Asian diaspora in Britain, Writing Across Worlds, Contemporary Writers Talk, India in Britain, Asian Britain, A Photographic History, and she's co-edited the first major literary and cultural history of Black and Asian British writing, published by Cambridge University Press. She's at present also compiling an essay anthology, Brave New Worlds, The Power of Writing Now, and the Bloomsbury Indians. She's currently Professor of Modern and Contemporary Literature at Queen Mary, where Wasafiri is based. And she received an MBE for her contribution to Black and Asian literature. Further ado, Susheila, thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. And I just wanted to say I'm really delighted to be chairing this absolutely exciting panel, which is part of the Chinese Diaspora Poetics of Home Festival. I know you're not only in for a rich poetic feast, but also for a stimulating discussion around questions of how we write home, how we write family from the multiple locations and voices of the diaspora. And thank you, Jennifer Wong, for inviting me to host tonight's event. Jenny, as you know, is a wonderful poet in her own right. So the four poets I have the privilege of hosting tonight, Jennifer Lee-Tsai, Kit Fan, Hannah Lowe, and Shirley Lim, straddle several different family and geographic histories, stretching from Hong Kong to Britain, from Malaysia to the US, from China to Jamaica to Britain. Writing such diasporic histories, whether remembering ancestors, the voices of earlier generations, or writing diaspora in the present, inevitably engages questions for many of disorientation or relocation, often on multiple levels, whether of lost or rediscovered histories, of stories written in languages perhaps never known, or in the transformations of memories into new forms and containers through poems and memoirs. So whilst the work of some of these poets explore the fragmentations of living elsewhere, trauma or a sense of loss, at the same time, many of the works importantly open up and define the imaginative spaces of new homes, often creating new visions of space, of porous, transnational and effective filial relations. So it's that kind of tension that I think is really interesting in many of the works I think that we're going to hear tonight. So just a few practical notes. After each reading, I'm going to follow each poet with a couple of specific questions if we have time. And at the end of the four readings, there'll be a brief general discussion between the panel, followed by questions from the audience. So please do write down anything that occurs to you as they're reading, so you can voice your questions at the end. So without further ado, let's start. I've cut down the bios, as you can read all the details online, so do follow up and buy the books. There are new collections, and many of these writers publish across genre, not just in poetry, crossing other boundaries by writing fiction, memoir, criticism and non-fiction. So we're going to start with Jennifer Lee-Tsai, who's both a poet and a critic. Born in Bebington and grew up in Liverpool, her work is widely published in magazines and journals, as well as in the Blood Axe anthology 10, Poets of the New Generation. Jennifer's debut pamphlet is Kismet, Ignition Press 2019, and she's going to read a bit from this tonight, as well as some new work. She's currently funded to do a doctorate in creative writing at the University of Liverpool, and was winner of a Northern Writers Award for Poetry 2020. So Jennifer, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Susheila, and for hosting tonight. I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you so much to Jenny as well for inviting me and for organising this wonderful festival. It's an honour to read for you all today, and I'm really excited also to be reading alongside Kit, Hannah and Shirley, and really looking forward to your readings tonight. So I'm going to read a mixture of old and newer work. So I'm going to begin with a couple of poems from my pamphlet Kismet, and two more recent poems. So family history, migration, language loss, trauma all play an important part in my work. And so I'll begin with my first poem, which is called Another Language. When I speak in Cantonese, I'm a different person, louder, brighter. The 6 tones ascending, descending, like musical notes. My grandparents leaving the fragrant harbour of Hong Kong, the Pearl River of Guangzhou, for the dream of a better life in the West. What did they make of English? Alighting from the liner at the docks, in the rain, hearing Liverpool accents for the first time. 2 gold koi swimming into the Mersey. So my next poem is called 1961, and this poem explores my family history through my maternal lineage. And it begins with an epigraph which is taken from Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, and the epigraph is, "The valley spirit never dies and is called mysterious female." My aunt speaks in the dialect of the Hakka tribe, a language I do not fully understand. Chinese gypsies, like dandelions, flourish in adverse soil, refuse to be trampled on, the women's feet unbound. She rises early in the morning, a hollow bamboo reed filled with amaranthine energy. She puts on dark loose trousers, oriental blouse, a black veiled hat. She lights incense, replenishes the bowls of oranges, white chrysanthemums on the ancestral altar. We remember. We pray for our dead. At night we sit in her tiny room. She tries to tell me what she saw, 1961, living in the same village as my grandmother in New Territories. My grandmother who one day drank weed killer by the harbour at Chateauguay. The next day we visit a temple to honour the gods of literature and war. 2 banyan wishing trees stand in the courtyard, their branches strewn with coloured streamers, fluttering desires. There is fire in me again. I feel her in my bones. I hear her in the songs of birds. My next poem is called Mersey River, and this poem is a homage to my paternal grandfather, who was a seaman on the Blue Funnel Line, which was a famous UK shipping company, which was founded in 1865 by Alfred Holt, and it played a really important part in Liverpool's maritime history and brought many Chinese seamen to Liverpool. So this poem is called Mersey River, and it's dedicated to my grandfather. Listen, some shattering in the void of my form. I hear your song, born on the cry of a seagull. The river flows, entranced by the sea's operatic language, which beguiles a geography of otherness. This otherness becomes me. I swim towards the coastline, clasping mementos from my grandfather, a Chinese passport, papers from the Blue Funnel Line, photographs in sepia, grandmother's jade pendant, translucent white-green. Blemished sea shapes rise and dissipate, twist and untwist. Speckles split the coastline, beyond waste chemicals, breaking stabilities on the scour like phonetic entities. One pulse through the murky field. Alluvium burls. Listen, I want to hear you speak to me. I do not want the city to forget you or the other sailors of Chinatown. Okay, so I'll just read two more poems, which are more recently written. So my next poem is addressed to my father and is inspired by an early childhood memory. I remember you were the first man who taught me about death. I was 5 years old. We were walking across the fields to my school. Do you remember, Ba? It was an autumn morning, I think. The trees dazzled us with their electricity. Popo had died in June on my sister's birthday. The deities in the house were covered with firecracker red paper. Removal of mirrors. A white cloth placed across the main door. The thin threads of mourning, her ghost trembling in the spaces between us. A black witch moth magnetized by flame, its singed wings. Burning of paper money, igniting of joss sticks. A soul table for the deceased. Coloured lights around the casket. Snow-white irises. White ribbons. White paper boats drifting down a stream. On the altar, photograph of Pawpaw in her youth. You and my uncles in black. As grandchildren, we wore dark blue. Later, a man from the same village as my grandparents paid tribute to her beauty, her skin as smooth as the dragon eye fruit. She gave birth to 4 boys, gambled her fortunes away in Liverpool's Chinatown. Was it somewhere on Nelson Street? Her first name means silver. I saw then the allure of memory. Her dusty wings beat fast, faster now, imploring me not to forget. I've always been entranced by her chatoyant colours, her shadows, her gloom. You held my hand and asked me if I remembered my grandmother. In Chinese there are no tenses, the past is the present, is the future. And in Cantonese, the language which I heard in my mother's womb, my original language, which has now been superseded by English. I told you, I remember. And my final poem is a prose poem about my grandfather, and the title of this poem is his name. Sai, after Ilya Kaminsky. When my grandfather was young, I believe he was a farmer in Guangdong during Mao's regime. There was war on peasants. It was a foul time. Black clouds menaced the sky, curses, 10,000 reports of darkness, deaths of humans, animals. People ate sweet potato leaves, tree bark, wild herbs. Mao said people were not without food all the year round, only 6 or 4 months. Babies were abandoned, unspeakable horrors took place, brutalities beyond comprehension. My grandfather escaped from China, came to Liverpool as a seaman on the Blue Funnel Line. He jumped ship. In this fair city he worked in a restaurant, though everyone said he looked more like an actor in a black and white film. He walked as though he was compelled by some external force. He had coal black hair, perfect posture, an elegant body which moved like water does, sometimes still, sometimes flowing, often running deep. His earth-brown eyes were intense. They had witnessed things you and I could only have nightmares about. He was the saddest man I ever met. His voice conjured the sound of the erhu, birds chirping, horses neighing, maidens undulating in dance, the pain of sorrow. In his 50s, Liverpudlians were kind to him when he visited cafes like the Cardamom on the corner of Whitechapel and Stanley Street. They liked him, this Chinese man in a trilby, long overcoat, polished black shoes. He would always tip generously because he knew what it was like to serve. My grandfather died on the streets of Liverpool, the port city he loved. Strangers rescued him from the pavement when he fell one bright afternoon in March. His heart, a yin organ, shaped like a lotus bud, broke. His friends were the people around him. 8 years after his death, I saw my grandfather in his best suit, sitting alone again in his favourite cafe with a cup of English tea, a slice of angel cake. He was smiling. I had never seen him smile or laugh before. He invited me to join him, gave me a lucky red envelope, said he did not mind me writing about him in my future poems, in a language he had never learnt or could ever speak. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Those were wonderful readings. In fact, that very last poem about your grandfather is a good point to start in a way with those lines. He did not mind me writing about him in my future poems in a language he'd never learnt or could ever speak. In a sense, you were in Mersey River as well, talking about this much wider Chinese diaspora, you know, Chinatown and all those lost Lascar sailors whose histories we know so little about. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of artifacts and materiality as triggers to memory and how you deal with that in terms of the language you're writing in now, which is of course divorced from the language of, for example, your grandfather, and how he saw the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I suppose you're right that there is so much that I don't really know about my grandparents, you know, particularly as, so I'm second generation, you know, British born Chinese, and I think that when they arrived in Liverpool, I mean, you know, I suppose, you know, referring to my paternal grandparents in the mid-1960s, there was not really much support probably for people of their generation and in their community. So, I mean, I think the question of artifacts, I mean, I think it's, I guess objects and mementos can be triggers and stimulus, I guess, for writing about certain things. But I think that really what I'm trying to do in my work is to reclaim fragments and to use them in, I don't know, new arrangements, yeah, I guess it's an act of recovery as well and recuperation.
I suppose what I was getting at, which comes up in the poem 1961, you speak of the body of your aunt in your bones, of rituals, a world you're physically carrying from the past.
Yeah.
In a sense, language is part of that body, or the new part of that body that you're carrying from the past.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, I'm very interested in, you know, the body and embodiment and, you know, how trauma is held in the body and is, you know, passed on through the generations and in a way that we can't really escape because, you know, we can't really escape our bodies. So I guess it's just trying to find ways to be embodied, to think about what embodiment really means.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much. Okay, we're going to move on now to our second poet, Kit Fan, who is also a novelist and poet and critic. his second poetry collection, As Slow as Possible, was a Poetry Society recommendation and the Irish Times Book of the Year. Diamond Hill, his debut novel about Hong Kong, has just been published, I think, with Dialogue Books of Little Brown. He was born in Hong Kong and moved to Britain at the age of 21. He's won a number of awards for both his fiction and poetry and now lives in York. Kit, would you like to begin? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Susheila, for your very thoughtful and luminous introduction. And thanks, Jenny, for introducing me to this festival, and also Wasafiri for organizing this wonderful festival. I think I'm in a very good company of poets tonight, and thank you for the audience coming on the late Friday night. I'm going to read 5 poems. I'm going to start with 2 poems from my first book called Paper, Scissors, Stone, because it's about family. Tonight, roughly, I'm going to start with a poem about a library in Hong Kong that has been destroyed. I was brought up in the library. When I say being brought up, I was literally being brought up in the library. My mum was a very clever woman. She knew that the books would do a better job than her. So, Paper, Scissors, Stone. It is not only the guilty secrets are hard to tell in the end. From the age of 6, my mother put me in the Telford Gardens Library in Kowloon's so that she could sweat in other people's kitchens. That was why I owned a library corner. Each shelf hour held me in custody. Page travels, lost milk teeth, and pre-myopia. Curled up in my shell in the sun with Little Red Riding Hood and King Midas, month by month, I crawled like a snail past spines of fairy tales before I knew the moon goddess, the dragon dance, dandelion, and chrysanthemum. There were years of afternoons, clouds and thunders without parents. I dreamt of an oven age, long corridors, dorm beds, wet sheets, breathing up against the wall. I made myself homeless, as if she would never come back, her hands tinted with bleach. I prayed that my book-lined womb would not be scissored apart, as pages and covers brazed the skin against the emperor's new clothes. And I wasn't totally wrong. That August, 7 years ago, the library was torn down, like many other things. No trace now of books, or shelves, or readers. Only dust, pits, cranes, and stones. The limbs of Orpheus are not there. Even though guilty secrets are hard to tell, I wish you could have told me why paper attracts scissors. Books turn to stone. I love the work of a Danish painter from the 19th century called Willem Hammershøi. I have no Danish, so terrible pronunciation there. He's a wonderful painter. He always painted very kind of subdued interior, barely any human beings in the room, or you think there's a human being, but they look so pale that they might as well be ghosts. But for me, that sense of the kind of emptiness of domestic bases evokes a lot about the home environment for me. So this poem is named after this painter called Hammershøi. At first, the room was still dark till a ray of sun landed on my feet, lightened after sleep. Empty-headed, I took my time in bed, listening to your downward flight. each naked step eliciting a syllable from the stairs of what the house wouldn't tell. How we found each other here, leaving our small islands for this bigger one, to learn, work, love, and root. It was late morning, or already noon. A bus went past. The dust moles were dancing in the sunbeams the way they do. 1 and 2 and 3, each speck drawing the light. A room painted white, a handleless door. The sun framed in 24 glass panes on Hammershaw's windows. I'm going to read 2 poems from my second book, poem called Poetry Got As Low As Possible. I'm going to start with a poem called The Night Switch. Not the light switch, but the night switch. This is a sanctuary, you say, turning a page, dotting the marginalia, while my pixelated eyes scan the news. Weather, dust in Syria, soiling the bed with white light pulsating through the night. There's not enough darkness in the mind. In my mind, my mother's bleached fluorescent hands counting money. In the background, the radio humming the news, whether Vietnamese refugees, and me lonely as a bird swallowing the cry of the jingling coins. She still does it every night, counting, then switching off the light in the corridor, her silhouette glowing in the traffic as if on fire, and my mind hiding in the thicket of a burning tree. There's a god, I think it's a Roman god called Janus, who is double-headed, one head looking at the past, the other head looking at the future. He is, interestingly, also a god of many things in the home environment, including the door, exits, passages, portals, the things that you often just walk past without noticing. That's Janus for you. So this poem is called Janus. Janus of the front door yet to be repainted, probably this spring in Hague blue. Of the porch door newly painted in a draft washed white. Of the kitchen door ajar, smell of a pork shoulder roasting in garlic and fennel seeds. Of the cat flap reserved for the sleek, handsome Pantalaimon and the regally neurotic Aphrodite. Of concrete and abstract things like change, passages, transitions, like climbing up the stairs to discover the things within human control, like frame within frame, the variations of blue and sea that make the beak of a hummingbird fit for a curlew. And the things beyond, like an unexpected phone call on a Sunday morning, disrupted lovemaking, the loss and tears that follow, thoughts of exits and entrance clouding over the mind on a cold, sunny day where everything has a shadow to make meaning of. I'm going to end with a new poem. I don't think there are ever things called new poem, but they're not published in the book yet, but that's why I think they're new. It's called Suddenly. It has a little epigraph from the great American novelist Elmore Leonard. The epigraph is, never use suddenly, the most overused, least needed word in fiction. Suddenly, oh, it's quite a long poem, so bear with me. Suddenly, the cloud knots unraveled and a droplet fell from a wound. 3 days of hard labor had broken her. She said she was too tired to name the boy. Suddenly, the blackened milk teeth gave up after a year of antibiotics. The doctors baffled. His locked mouth was fed strips solidified saliva to clear his feverish chest. Home left him suddenly. At a zebra crossing, his father suddenly took his hand. No cars, no danger ahead. But being held was a strange thing. Moving in with his family, stranger. Suddenly, he stopped speaking first week at school. Teacher called his mother in. When asked to explain the silence, he said he had nothing to say. Suddenly, at 14, on a bridge, he vowed never to reproduce. Desire suddenly overtook fear. After watching Kieslowski's Decalogue in one sitting, he spelled out his heart and asked what togetherness meant. Joe walked off in the rain. Years later, suddenly, he discovered from the book of not watching Decalogue, not asking the right question, not spelling things out, no Joe and no rain. Suddenly, a handful of milk seeds, and suddenly, man. Suddenly, 2001, 2 professors persuaded him to study a malleable thing called literature. Hong Kong had returned to China, but he flew to Britain. Suddenly, people spoke Yorkshire, love on a bus, love in the shops. Yorkshire stared at him, and he stared back, like 2 neurons in a busy translation loop. Suddenly, one autumn, he found love and blockades, a logjam, and suddenly diversions. Everywhere, the road signs read divorce, teenagers, anorexia. He claimed driving was in his DNA because his father was a taxi driver. Suddenly, his tongue tripped on the English alphabet when he rebuilt Telford Gardens Library he was brought up in, but now demolished. People called that poetry. Suddenly, a voice, a temporary abode. Suddenly, he failed and blamed the words and the ship's saliva. How many edible bird nests were robbed in exchange of a lottery of half-tuned stolen keys? And what could he say to the superior blast that suddenly erased his vocal cords, retinas, eardrums, taste buds, and all the tensions on his fingertips, tendons, heart? Suddenly, rain churns up the clouds and stops. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great to listen to. Well, there's lots of things there. You started off by saying home is a kind of library, as you call it, and I think you mentioned it in that opening poem, but it's also kind of womb-like space, an alternative mother or motherland of language. And later you talk about it, I think in one of the later poems, as a sanctuary. I wonder if you could comment on that in terms of the dislocation of your own departure and being a writer sort of transplanted into Yorkshire, if that makes any sense. That kind of transplantation from that womb-like library to Yorkshire. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I think dislocations are overrated. We talked about it to death. I think for me, the sense of home started in books when I realized that I can live in stories that I am not part of. When I realized that actually, I think that's the biggest gift that my mum has given me, and I think she's actually very proud of it. Instead of having a nanny or whatever, we couldn't afford to have a nanny anyway. She was too busy working, and she just put me in the library. I don't think nowadays you could be allowed to do that. But the librarians were very rude and professional. But I think, sorry, I totally missed what you're asking me.
Well, just the idea, I mean, of the language of your reading in a way, because home becomes a kind of library, so language is a kind of library. And as you were saying, just the stories that become a kind of shroud or sanctuary around you, protecting you. I was just interested in that idea of language and the myths and stories you read, which may not have necessarily related to Hong Kong at the time.
Yeah, language is sanctuary. I'm not very conscious of it when I'm writing, to be honest. I think it's just a way of self-expression, and I am wary of elevating the power of language, among other things, because language is very important to me. Without that, I wouldn't be talking to you now. But I do think that there are more abstract and invisible things, often unspoken, that are equally powerful as a human emotion, but also solidarity. So I think language is, of course, like massively important, but I don't like it being elevated to some kind of a god. It's just dangerous.
Okay, we'll probably have to move on. I mean, I think that's interesting, because I was going to say, with Suddenly and Janus, in a sense, you seem to be deflating language and talking about absences and gaps between the lines. So maybe we can come back to that later, as we should move on now to Hannah. Hannah, like Kit, works in lots of genres. She's a poet, a memoirist, and a critic. Named a Poetry Book Society Next Generation Poet in 2014. She won the Cholmondeley Award from the Society of Authors in 2020. She's had several award-winning collections and a memoir, and her recent collection of sonnets to kids has just appeared and is the Poetry Book Society choice for the autumn this year. She's been committed to education, I think, throughout her life, and she taught secondary age children at one point and is now a senior lecturer in creative writing at Brunel University. She grew up in Ilford, the child of an English mother and a Chinese Jamaican father. Hannah, would you like to?
Great, thanks so much. So nice to be here. Thanks to you, Susheila and Jenny. And I'll start by reading, I'm going to read a few poems from Chick, my first collection, and I'll read a few from the kids, which is the latest one. Picture on the front there is my dad in 1954 on a roof in Hampstead, by which time he'd already been in England for 7 years. That's my much older brother there, who's now 65. So just to give you a sense of the history there. And the poem I'm going to read, it was a commission for the 2012 Olympics. They were looking for people that identified with more than one nation, or had an affiliation to more than one nation. I got thinking about how the white and English via my mother was present in my upbringing, also the Afro Jamaican and the Chinese. And I was thinking about the kind of iconography of those places in the house in which I grew up. 3 treasures. Jamaica in the attic, in a dark blue trunk, seesaw in the hinges. What must it look like, all that wide blue sea? England downstairs in a rocking chair, Nana rocking with her playing cards, cigs and toffee, tepid tea. Jamaica frying chicken in the kitchen, pig snout in the stew pot, breakfast pan of saltfish and ackee. China in the wonton skin, gold songbird in the brittle porcelain, pink pagoda silk settee. Jamaica in the statues, lignum vitae heads of dreadlocks, and Nancy, rebel spider, in the storybooks, the poetry. England eating peaches on the patio, hopscotching, my mum in wellies, secateurs around the rosebush and the raspberries. England painting midnight with a sparkler, cousins throwing Guy Fawkes on the bonfire, orange ash confetti. England for the English in graffiti on the roundabouts and bus shelters, please sir on TV. Jamaica on the phone at 3 a.m, my father's back home voice through false and crack, my friend, long time no see. China in the Cantonese he knew but wouldn't speak, in letters stuffed in shoeboxes, ink stick calligraphy. China in his slender bones, in coral birds of stitched bamboo. China in an origami butterfly that flew. I should say that these poems that are in Chick are so much the work of my imagination, because it was before I'd gone and done the real research into my family history. And it's interesting to read these poems now. I noticed that there are slippages, there are mistakes, in fact, that my father wouldn't have spoken Cantonese. He'd have spoken like Jennifer's, Hakka. That was the dialect that he spoke. That was his father's, my grandfather's Chinese ethnicity. And there are other little mistakes and slippages in this book, things that I don't want to amend, but it's kind of interesting. I guess it's that whole idea about the diasporic imagination. It sounds like a diagnosis, but I obviously had this urge to recreate and like recuperate, as Jennifer said. And I'm doing that in the next poem that I'll read to you as well. I should say that we lived in uneasy tension with my nan, who lived downstairs, my mum's mum, who was a right racist, and my mum and dad upstairs parading their miscegenation above her head. And my dad loved to cook, and he cooked lots of Jamaican food and lots of kind of staples of the Caribbean. And one of the things he used to make was lapchong, Chinese sausages. And Jamaica, he'd learned to make them. His father had taught him how to make them, and they would hang them out to dry outside in the sun. But in Ilford, Essex, they were hung on our washing line. Sausages. They hang between the washing line, between the tea towels and the bleach sheets. He has pegged them in neat clusters, dark fingers of blood and gristle with twisted ends and oily skins. They flame against the trees. She smells them from the back door, ginger, clove and fennel. The house is quiet. He is hiding from her. Her mother told her not to marry a foreigner. You always wanted to be different, she hissed. Now this. He's black and old enough to be your father. The sausages are Chinese dragon red, the red of a chili or a shamed face. They gather fire drying on her line. This is Ilford, Essex, 1965. The neighbours eat mince and cabbage and talk about her. She asked him not to do it, but they taste like home to him, and he is like good food to her. Tonight they will eat sausages together, and she will lick the oil and spice from his hands. I'll read one other poem from Chick. So I knew very little about either of my grandparents in the Caribbean. I just had, a scattering of facts or fragments, maybe, unverified facts, actually, I think. But I knew that my grandmother had had my father when she was very young, 14 or 15, that she'd been a maid in his father's shop. His father was a Chinese shopkeeper, as many of the Chinese are in Jamaica. And we had one photograph of her. In that photograph, she looks incredibly glamorous. And I think that is the kind of the catalyst to this poem. And although she had a very hard life, she did in the end marry quite a wealthy man. He gets a little mention at the end of this poem. Grandmother. My grandmother comes calling on cold nights in England. She is no old lady, She wears honey-coloured stockings, red dresses with nipped waists, paints her nails exotic flower shades, smells of oranges, hibiscus. Lord girl, she says from the end of my bed, how come you white? How come so tall? And she mutters Cantonese to my bedroom walls. And when I wake, she's at the mirror, scratching in her eyebrows with the charred end of a match, saying, Mr. Warwin Pennyfeather, I curse the day I heard that name. So I'll read a couple of poems, few poems from my new collection, Chick. And in the subject matter, this book is quite different, and for the kids, quite different from Chick. But I'll read the poems that are in there that kind of touch on the same family themes. And I think, you know, I think I've now written sort of 3.5 books about my dad, and my mum gets so little mention. She's present in this book. And I'll read a poem about her playing the piano. But one of the things I think about with my father is that he died when I was in my early 20s, and he never spoke about his migration, his life in Jamaica. He would have had a hard time in both places. But my sort of affiliations, or like my sensibility, was always kind of in tune with his experience, even when I didn't know that I was really that interested in him. So like at university, I did a lot of modules in Black American literature, because Black American literature seemed to be the thing that, this is like 20 odd years ago, was much more sort of prevalent than any discussion or teaching about the Black Britishness. But much, much earlier than that, I remember like a real key nodal point in my upbringing was that loving the music, like Black American music. And in this poem, Scott Joplin gets a mention. Scott Joplin, the ragtime composer from the 19th century. And I think even as a child, I was overlaying my father's experience or linking that with the experience of Scott Joplin. But the focalizer is my mother. And the poem's called Bethina, which is a Scott Joplin waltz. If I asked, she'd put down her cigarettes or tea towel and sit on the emerald velvet stool. And from her hands, tight knitted hands, the notes fell out like gloves unraveling their wool. She'd play Scott Joplin's waltz, Bethina, its title like her name, so I thought that song was hers, its pining melody, a silk scarf fall of crotchets, quavers. That song was in her fingers, like there are songs in mine, though I rarely play, so little time. But today I'm listening to Scott Joplin on my speaker and thinking of the green and glacial drawing room, the way she played those dying phrases, the grace, the pain. Bethany was my mother's given name. I'll read, this book is all sonnets, by the way, so these poems are quite short. Well, I'll read a poem that's about the house that I grew up in. So it kind of takes from some of the ideas from Three Treasures, where I think the trunk that was in the attic, for me, is a great metaphor for all the mystery, the unopened trunk. What was in that trunk that my father had brought with him? I believe from Jamaica, but it's unverified. And it's about the kind of instability of my upbringing, which in many ways was very confusing. My mother having a very kind of orthodox occupation as a primary school teacher. My father was a professional gambler. All the things that were unsaid, the confusion around class. The poem's called House. This poem is like a house where I once lived. Upstairs, 4 rooms where everyone I loved lay and dreamt their solitary dreams. The sound of crying in the turquoise bathroom, the tap's fat drip. Above our heads, an attic with a splintered window, spongy dust, bare brick, a battered trunk that held an ocean, another of shame, and from the rafters, rain and rain and rain. Downstairs, a different weather, 4 muggy rooms, the telly's sunny blether, a technicolour garden. I hopped the path on my red space hopper and raised my hand to wave at a girl who looked like me, upstairs, her hands and face pressed tightly to the glass. And I'll read 2 more poems. both sonnets. And the next one is really about what poetry can do or what it can't do. It's called The River. Not another poem about my father, as though he's been forever running through me, rising, churning like the Yalis River where he was born. That river flooded yearly so no one could cross. What have I learned after all these years of loss? At poetry readings, I perform him, hope for sighs or laughter. I paint him at casino tables, cooking Chinese suppers, lying in the spare room, dying. I want applause, but see the real man standing at the door. There's something he wants to say, and nothing's been forgiven. Then I hear the water rushing down the corridor. He's swimming hard, but it carries him away. And I'll finish something with a poem that, you know, so much of my work is about going back into the past, into the archive, into the archives of memory. And this poem is about my son, who, having not been told, or that so much silence about my family history growing up, I'm almost like possibly slightly overzealous that my little boy knows exactly where he comes from. So even though he's like pale as, you know, anything, and he's got bright red hair, he happily goes around telling people at school that he's Chinese. And it's about him learning to speak Chinese. The poem's called Ni Hao. In bed this morning, reading Adrian Rich, Rory beside me, watching a lime green monster called Muzzy on his iPad. Muzzy is teaching my son Chinese. Ni hao, the boy says over and over. Outside, the birds have been saying hello for hours, and the early sky has finally bloomed to blue. Somewhere, someone's playing a piano. Every man I bring into this bedroom says books regarding the shells, the jamboree of books in every colour, stacked 2 rows thick. Who knows how many words, not all of them read. But this April morning, it's diving into the wreck. And I think, is this what aloneness is? A warm bed, my books, this small boy flowering beside me.
Thanks very much, Hannah. It's great to listen to those sonnets, many of which I haven't heard. When I was looking at the new book, and I was fascinated by what you're doing with education in schools and the intersections between all those multiple identities, your father still, as you say in that poem, The River, still seems to be everywhere.
Yeah.
And I think you even, the prologue is even mentioning a father figure. I mean, I just wondered if you could talk about that, and also the difficulties of writing family members, even though it was your father, and the ethics that faced you in doing that.
Yeah, maybe I can say something about my experiences as a teacher first, which is that, you know, teaching, it's an incredibly rewarding and challenging occupation. And I taught for much of the 2000s in a kind of an inner city, very multicultural sixth form. And at that time, like, I hadn't started writing yet. I fell in love with poetry through trying to infuse all these slightly disengaged students. I think the only person I might have infused was myself. But I was also fascinated by them, many of them second, third, fourth generation. Some of them born in Hackney, say, grew up in Hackney, never left Hackney or Stoke Newington or wherever. And yet if you ask them about their relationship to Britishness, often those kids would say they weren't British, they were Ghanaian or Jamaican or Eastern European, because we had Eastern European young people coming at that time. And that really interested me, because I had the same kind of conflicted ideas about my own identity. And it was really through teaching that I began to think about my own identity, my father, the legacies of colonialism and empire. And so the book is really kind of trying to say those quite complicated things, but in sonnets. So there's lots of ethical questions about writing about those young people. But of course, I'm using all the strategies that writers do to anonymize them, conflating students so that one student actually didn't really exist, but the experience exists, or I've conflated those experiences into one focalizing student, a student of my imagination. And I think the ethical questions are different when you're writing about family. they can either be much more pressing because family members might object strongly to your version of events, or you might feel, as I have sometimes, that I've often felt with my father that he would give me permission to write because he's my dad, right? But on the other hand, I can't know that. I sometimes can sort of imagine him sort of slapping his forehead saying, will you stop now? Is enough enough? But I suppose, again, with his life, it's that weighing up this idea that he was such a marginalized person, my dad, like largely uneducated, but very, very bright, self-educated. And I felt like his story was unusual in that it illustrated something that wasn't known about much here at that time, which was the Chinese Caribbean, and that it was illustrative. One man's story was important to tell in terms of what the empire, what the legacies of colonialism had done, how they had limited his life, you know, how they dictated his kind of life choices. So I guess I was weighing those ideas up, the personal exposure versus this kind of bigger picture. And all I can do is hope that my work sits okay with other people in the communities that I write about. And I think research is a really crucial thing. Like, if you're going to write about Jamaica and you haven't grown up there, then you need to do your research. And I guess I've tried to do that. But the ethical thing is always a minefield. And every new book, every poem presents new ethical challenges for me. Thank you.
I mean, one thing, obviously, I don't know whether this was partly what fired it, but, you know, I love the line, you know, about the Chinese sausages on the proverbial English washing line, you know, because your Chinese identity was sort of hidden as a child growing up in Ilford. And in a way, that washing line interrupts the English lines of the Ilford world. But and there's at the same time this trunk in the attic with the ocean locked away. But I just wondered why you write less about your mother.
Oh, one of the things I forgot to say about the ethics, of course, is my father isn't alive anymore, whereas my mother is. Okay. And so that's one big reason. And I suppose, you know, my father's death was a catalyst to me writing. Yeah, absolutely. With his passing, I felt such a kind of psychic shock, not only at the death of a father, but the loss of that story. Whereas I guess I've all kind of felt my mother was maybe more available in some ways, and she's beginning to emerge in poems. But writing about her raises questions, I suppose, for me as a writer and anyone else that is writing about relationships that are difficult, which my relationship with my mother is, you know. And so again, there's big ethical questions about that as well. But I suspect she will filter more and more into my work as the years go by.
It's interesting though, because in a way that the kids has a kind of, it's all about those kind of hidden intersections which people carry that they don't necessarily see, of all kinds of diasporas. But yeah, I mean, I guess we should move on now, but thank you so much. And we'll come back to some of these questions at the end. So our last reader is Shirley Lim, who received the Commonwealth Poetry Prize, the first for a woman and an Asian. She was born in Malacca in Malaysia and raised by her Chinese father and attended missionary schools. Her work reflects both her Chinese Malayan heritage as well as her current residence in the US. And she's published a huge range of work, 10 award-winning collections of poetry, 3 collections of short stories, 2 novels, a children's novel and a memoir. Her poems have been widely anthologized, set to music, translated. She's received lots of book awards and lifetime awards. She's now emeritus at the University of California in Santa Barbara. So Shirley, would you like to start? And I should say that in terms of the group that are reading here tonight, who are currently all UK based, Shirley's based in the US. And so she's coming from a sort of slightly different angle in terms of the Chinese diaspora, because it's kind of very different experience. So Shirley, thank you.
I'd like to begin, as all the poets did, with thanking Jennifer and Susheila for hosting this wonderful event. For me, it's a fabulous event because it's the first time really that I've been listening to UK Chinese diasporic poets, and you all have such fresh voices. I want to thank these poets who have just read really because it's so uplifting for me to hear your voices. And this reading for me is really quite stressful because my extended Lim family in the US, in Canada, and elsewhere are online to listen to me read poetry of family history. And of course, they share my family history. So to take up Hannah's notion of the ethical, I have to be really careful that what I'm reading jibes with what they remember and understand. So I also have extended family who are not Lims. I see one of them from Italy, Matsura Alatas, originally from Malaysia. Hi, Matsura. And friends in the UK, I think Alan Johnson, Professor Johnson had told me that he would register and be online. So I have a whole host of people who will be scrutinizing my reading for whatever. So I'll begin, as some of you did, by talking about grandmothers. And I begin with the poem Ama, which is Hokkien. I'm a Hokkien speaker for grandmother. And this grandmother is special because she was my grandfather's second wife, and she had no children. So she was not a biological grandmother to me. I don't have any memories of my biological paternal grandmother, but I remember this grandmother very, very clearly. Grandmother was smaller than me at 8. Had she been child forever? Helpless, hopeless, chin sharp as a knuckle, fan face hardly half opened, not a scrap of fat anywhere. She tottered in black silk, leaning on handmaids on 2 tortured fins. At 60, his sons all married. Grandfather bought her, Su Chow flower song girl. Every bone in her feet had been broken, bound tighter than any neighbor's sweet daughters. 10 toes and instep curled under, yellow petals of chrysanthemum wrapped by gold cloth. He bought the young face, small knobby breasts. He swore he'd not dressed with sarong of maternity. Each night, he held her feet in his palms, like lotus on the tight hollows of celestial lakes. Against the calluses, her weightless soles, cool and slack, clenched by his strangest fever. So with that kind of history of misogyny, pedophilia, and all kinds of gender issues, it's no wonder that I tried to escape from diasporic China to the United States, which is what my second poem addresses, What the Fortune Teller Didn't Say. But this is a poem about my mother. What the Fortune Teller Didn't Say. When the old man and his crow picked the long folded parchment to tell my fortune at 5, they never told about leaving, the burning tarmac in giant wheels, or arriving, while immigrants fear the malice of citizens and dull shudderings of those who hate you whatever you do. My mother did not grip my hand more possessively. Did I cry, and was it corn ice cream she fed me because the bird foretold a husband? Wedded to unhappiness, she knew I would make it, meaning money, a Mercedes, and men. She saw them shining in the tropical mildew that greened the corner alley where the blind man and his molten crow squatted, promising my 5-year-old hand this future. Of large faith, she thrust a practical note into the bamboo container, a shiny brown cylinder I wanted for myself, for a cage for field crickets. With this fortune my mother bought, only the husband is present. White as a peeled root, furry with good intentions, his big nose smelling a scam. Sometimes living with him, I shake the cylinder of memory and tell my fortune all over again. My mother returns, bearing the bamboo that we will fill with green singing crickets. Then, of course, as my father's daughter, I have numerous poems from my father, many of them written on the anniversary of his death. I am a father's daughter before I am a mother's daughter. The poem is titled Father in China. He was born in Malaysia, but he went to China for medical care and then came back to Malaysia to die. My father from Malaysia stands under a tree in China 15 years ago, a lychee tree in Canton's People's Park. Mr. Wu, who is also at the clinic, takes the picture with slightly shaking hands. It is a frugal picture, black and white, 2 inches by 2 inches, sent across 2 oceans, creased by crazy white lines like a cracked egg. Although for 15 years, I have preserved it in plastic between student visas, in a succession of wallets, between checkbook and dollar notes. He is gaunt, he who loves oyster omelets, long noodles, pure white of pork fat between skin and lean. Now he counts his white blood cells, reciting numbers and letters home as he recited mahjong scores a year ago. He will not let the Malaysian doctor cut his throat. He writes, Chinese medicine can also calibrate blood cells. I am unhoused in yet another country. I do not know how to write to him. I do not have his motherland address. I do not pick up the black coffin telephone. No one tells me he's dead till he's been buried. Today, I would call Canton person to person. I'd say, I booked a ticket for you to Sloan Kettering. See, I have bank accounts and dollar notes to save your life here in another country. Instead, I write this poem. And that's what I do for my father. I write poems to him. And of course, as a diasporic Malacca Chinese, I keep returning to my hometown, Malacca. And I write a lot about Malacca. So here's one called Visiting Malacca, which is my ancestral family home. Someone lives in the old house. Gold leaf carving adorns the doors. Black wooden stairs still stand and wind like arms of slender women leading to the upper floors. It is as I remembered, but not itself, not empty, clean. Someone has scrubbed the sandstone squares and turned them red. The marble yard is stained with rain, but it has not fallen into ruin. Weeds have not seeded the roofs, nor cracked flowered tiles grandfather brought shining in crates from China. Someone has saved the old house. It is no longer dark with opium or with children running crowded through passageways. The well has been kept, the moon windows boarded, although something of China remains, although ancestral family is gone. I dream of the old house. The dreams leak slowly like sap welling from a wound. I'm losing ability to make myself at home. Awake, hunting for lost cousins, I have dreamt of ruined meaning and am glad to find none. My lost cousins, by the way, are in Pennsylvania, and they are now listening to me doing the reading. Of course, as a diasporic Chinese, I have been very mobile, moving from Massachusetts to New York and now to California. And so this poem is called Riding into California. If you come to a land with no ancestors to bless you, you have to be your own ancestor. The veterans in the Mobile Home Park don't want to be there. It isn't easy. Oil rigs litter the land like giant frozen birds. Ghosts welcome us to a new life, and an immigrant without home ghosts cannot believe the land is real. So you're grateful for familiarity, and Bruce Lee becomes your hero. Coming into Fullerton, everyone waiting at the station is white. The good thing about being Chinese on Amtrak is no one sits next to you. The bad thing is you ride alone all the way to Irvine. And my final poem is dedicated to my son, Gershom Baserman, raised Jewish American, whose only real Malay word is sayang, which means love, but who considers himself also Chinese because he has a Chinese middle name. And it is titled Keeping Your Distance, which is the angst, the anguish that diasporic immigrant Chinese parents carry with them, that they have children, unlike Hannah's son, who grow up distance in every way. Keeping your distance is what you do best, although it is also what I totally cannot do. But I am trying. I am trying. Distance is what the needle shows as the car runs and runs, eating up miles like dessert. The needle flicking at 60, 70, a straight pointing thing that jets air and my heart, breaking down from carb overload and the stress of this learning. I am learning what Americans do so well, staying out of each other's hair, far, far away. Not even a voice on the voicemail. Mail reduced to ease and digital flashes like the flashing of turn signals. I am turning 60 soon myself, like the engine, revving past Highway 101 speed limits, past the brute Pacific, is blue and marine life hidden under the blanket of sunshine on my left. You are America, sweet brown grapeland, alien mustard seed, transplanted Europe and Asia, cultivated, wild, exotic, as native here as almost anything, like me, like me. The needle points homeward, keeping count of distances traveled. We two on separate roads. This land produces the story I'm telling you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you very much for that wonderful reading. I mean, Shirley, you're in the US, as I've already said, and joining us from there. And I know much of your writing focuses on your past and on your family, and to some degree celebrates it. You're looking at generational histories, as you did at the early poems, and it's all very tactile. But as you say, there's also a deep sense of trauma in the poems, the leaving in what the fortune teller didn't say, for example. How do you reconcile these things with the stories you're trying to create in a new land, the transnational poetics?
I am working on the reconciliation. One way is through scholarship. So I have worked with a dear friend at Stanford. We co-founded an online journal called Transnational American Studies. And this work, productive, to reconcile various identities that come from everywhere globally into a matrix of understandings and intuitions is very healing for me. So it's just not a scholarly project. It is a psychological healing for me. That's one way to do it. And of course, I do it through my creative writing. One of my first poems, I said that every poem begins with a lie. So when you're writing poetry, you're writing truth, but the truth is always slanted, and you're writing stories. And every time you write a poem, it's being mediated by language. I was so taken by how many of the poets that read before me talked about language and the struggle between that home language, the family language, and the language of English. And I have to say that I have not had that struggle very much, because I have a profound love of the English language. You know, I mean, I hardly ever dream in Chinese. When I did once, I wrote about it. I am profoundly in love with the English language. I love its musicality. I love its poetic forms. I love the sonnet. I love the villanelle. I love the prose forms, which is why I'm multi-genre. So yeah, it's a trauma that is productive when it doesn't threaten you with self-harming ideations.
Okay, I'm going to, just aware of time, so I'm going to go into join you with the rest of the group, because some of the next question I was going to ask you is kind of related to the writing that others have done. I mean, one thing, I guess, which is a broad question about the Chinese diaspora, if you like, and writing home and writing family. Obviously, Chinese-ness, if you like, and China are very different things at the moment, and trying to stress Chinese identities through family histories, but inevitably political issues surface. And I just wondered, as writers who are primarily dealing with aesthetics, how you cope with that, the kind of political element of your work, if that actually even enters into your thinking. Anyone can please just join, whoever wants to. I can't see all of you at the moment because I'm on a different view. I'm just going to change it actually right now. See if I can get it onto a bigger screen. That's it. Yeah. Has anyone got that? Maybe you should raise your hand if you want to say something. Yeah, Jennifer.
Yeah, I guess I could say something about that. I mean, because I am also really interested in you know, questions of what Chineseness is. And I guess more recently, in my more recent work, I've been exploring those ideas through thinking a lot about Chinese women in relation to my own personal and family history, and in relation to my maternal grandmother in particular. And I don't know, she very tragically you know, died when my mother was only a few years old, and it was suicide. And I guess I've been writing about her recently, and you know, my most recent poem, which is quite a long piece, and it's a piece which is in progress. I'm also working on a lyric essay in relation to these themes of Chinese female identity and so on. And I'm also very interested in Julia Kristeva's work, and you know, her interrogation of Chinese women. And yeah, there's a quote from Kristeva which I actually have in front of me, and I think it relates well to what you're saying, which is suicide without a cause or silent sacrifice for an apparent cause, which in our age is usually political. A woman can carry off such things without tragedy, without even drama. So yeah, so I think that's a quite a huge question, which I'm still currently engaging with.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to add anything? I mean, I'll move on to Hannah.
I can say something about, what's the question about how you bring together, whether it's a problem bringing together the political with the aesthetic?
Yeah, well, just how it works for you as writers, really. In terms of, I mean, I guess right now with China and Chinese, and obviously with what's been going on in Hong Kong, these issues are, and what's going on in China at the moment, there's a lot of political reverberations and obviously all Chinese diasporas are not the same, as we know, with many diasporas, and everybody's got a different experience. And I just wondered how in relation to your own experience you maybe deal with those issues.
Yeah, well, I should say firsthand, because I basically pass as white, and most people seem to think I'm Polish these days. You know, those are not my first-hand experiences, but in my writing, I am deliberately and consciously political. Like, I don't shy away from that at all. When you see the front cover of The Kids, it pictures me and my college friends at an anti-racist demonstration. So, you know, I think poetry can be a great vehicle for expressing politics, and my politics are anti-racist and left-wing, and I'm not apologetic for that at all. And I think the poem can carry those politics. And in terms of so thinking about, I mean, the kind of increased xenophobia that's arisen out of the pandemic, for example. One of the projects that I've been working on is looking at the way the kind of scandalous reporting and the scandalous behaviour around the old Chinatown at Limehouse. That's like a new project that I'm working on. So the China House that existed at the turn of last century. And it's so interesting to see how similar ideas are being regurgitated, the anti-Chinese feelings, the fear of the other, all that kind of yellow peril thing. And it's almost like mystifying to me how those same deeply problematic ideas can be spun again and again and again, and you know, remain unchallenged, you know. So I think I mean, of course, I think writers don't have to be political, but for me, it seems to be a crucial part of my agenda.
Okay. I think we should, sorry, Shirley, I think we should probably, how are we doing, Jenny, for time? We should probably open it to the audience. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. I don't know whether we have any questions so that people can ask the poets anything they want. I've got lots more questions, so but I've had my turn.
Anyone wants to raise a question, can you raise your hand virtually, or maybe unmute yourself?
Is it possible for the audience to raise a question?
Yeah.
Maybe shy, maybe you can see.
Doesn't sound like anyone wants to ask a question.
Okay, well, maybe Shirley, hello, this is Mastura from Italy.
All the way from Italy. Hello.
Yes, hello. Well, I suppose it's just a general question to everyone, since we're speaking about diasporic identity. But when does home stop feeling like home? How far do we have to be away, and for how long do we have to be away from home in order for it to stop feeling like home? Or is home just the nearest place? And if that's the case, why are we always writing about the past, which is far away? I suppose it's just a general reflection for the writers to consider.
I'd like to answer that question. Maxine Hong Kingston said to her mother, who was always talking about China as home, and Maxine said to her mother in her memoir, and I'm reading from her memoir here, "Mother, we belong to the planet," right? And so now in this moment of real crisis, climate crisis, I think we should really be reminded that we need to stop fucking around with the idea of this one place this original home being home, but that the entire fragile, blue, shining gem is the home for all of us. And then all of us can then be protective and be loving to this home, which is our planet. Yeah. But having said that, I have to tell you, having moved from home to home, home is where you walk all the time.
The nearest place.
Yeah. A place all the time, over and over again, that becomes your home. So for me now, home is where I am walking every day, which is Santa Barbara. And one of my last, The Irreversible Sun, really is my Santa Barbara book. Sure. And if I were in my last 1/4 of my life or 1/5 of my life be moved to Massachusetts and I have to walk every day around Massachusetts, that would be my home. That is, the flaneur, you know, makes a home. But
I guess,
the home is the planet.
I guess at the end of the day, the writer doesn't really need to choose. I mean, because we have our obsessions in our writing. I mean, I write about Italy, but I also write about Malaysia and Singapore, where I was born and grew up. And it's the same with you. And it's the same for many of the writers here today. So I guess we're fortunate in the sense that we don't have to choose one home. But how does it translate into the actual tensions and you know, the actual relationship to the writing? Because well, you know, that was what my question was driving at, sort of.
I'd like
but
to hear
anyway.
from Fan, because we have not heard from Kit yet.
Yes.
From Hong Kong, when he was really quite grown up.
Okay, what should I say? I found that home, I think home could be a choice if we choose to live somewhere else. But then increasingly, I feel like it's not us, not me leaving home, but the home is leaving me. It is possible that a place, Shirley said it very eloquently, a place that we identify so intimately with for years could actually, they could actually decide that they don't want us anymore. And I think, Shirley, you put it very rightly, it is possible that planet Earth doesn't want us anymore. It is also possible that a city could change so dramatically in a way that the city is expelling the people that live there. So I do think that the lawyers would say it's a contractual agreement. And ultimately we all have a passport. It was kind of consolidated after the Second World War, and the passport is a legal document. Whether we like it or not, some people have multiple passports, but we are all contractually bound to a country, a nationality, and that is very troubling for some people, but also full of potential. That's what immigration started, isn't it? Go Rush.
I think we've got one more question here, just to jump, which is from Nina Morgan. I don't know, it's on the chat, which is going back to your poetry really directly. She addresses this to everybody. What do you want your readers to experience in reading your poems? Can you please answer, each of you, in 1 or 2 or 3 words? That's difficult. What do you want people to experience when they read your poems? If you want them to experience anything.
I can't say it in 1 or 2 words. I would say, I knew someone in a writing workshop years ago was talking about the idea from Roland Barthes's camera lucida about the punctum. It's the moment that punctures you when you're looking at a photograph, that there's something that you see in the photograph that touches you, that interrupts you in some way, not as violent as a puncture necessarily. And I suppose that's what I want. I want there to be a moment in every poem where it's either the gut punch is too violent a phrase, but it might actually be laughter, but there to be some shift momentarily, or temporarily, or longer. There's a moment that reaches out and grabs the reader and makes them feel something. I suppose the punctum. I love that idea.
Does anyone else want to add just quickly before we close?
I have one word I want the reader to say, which is ha.
Anyone else?
My word will be baffled.
Okay. Jennifer?
Yeah, it's a really good question, but quite difficult to answer. So I think
Yeah.
off the top of my head, I'm just going to say mystified.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to have to sadly draw this to a close, because this is a great discussion, and we could. I've got several more questions, and all I'd like to say is that, I mean, in terms of reading, I've really, really enjoyed reading all of your work, some of which I didn't know that well. So that's been a wonderful journey. And thank you very much for reading tonight and for being so generous with your time on a Friday evening, Friday morning for you, Shirley. And thank you to Jennifer Wong for inviting me to host this, and to Wasafiri and to Oxford Brookes, whom I know are partners. Jennifer, you've got your hand up there.
Meant to be applause.
Sorry,
Susheila, there's actually one more question, but
sorry. Okay, I missed one. Okay,
there's one little question from Wendy. I
didn't see that one.
Mute herself.
Thank you so much. And just one last question for me is that come across very striking from Professor Shirley Lim. She mentioned that every poem begin with a lie, and at the very beginning, Jennifer mentioned that poetry is about reclaiming the fragments, or is an act of recovery. So I was wondering, as poets, how do you guys sort of come to terms with this conflict or tension between like truthfulness and lie, and the sincerity and fictional element? And hi, Shirley, I'm not sure if you still remember me. Yeah, I'm in one of your workshops with Dr. Jeffrey Mather, and I'm actually, if you still remember, I'm a recipient of your scholarship. It's so good to be able to meet you online again. Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
She's a poet herself, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity, for the amazing readings. Yeah.
Well, maybe
I'd like to
someone
take that.
The tension between the kind of truth you want to write about and the fictionality of your recuperation.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. It's a really great question. I think just quite simply, I think it's an ongoing process. I think it's a continual negotiation, yet between different boundaries and different conflicts and different struggles.
And Hannah says research, right, Hannah? Research, but research is important for you.
Yeah, I think like you, the scholarly place is a place of healing for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, as much as whatever the archive yields, but, the archives aren't always complete. Sometimes they don't exist as well. So the personal archive, the things that you have, that, the records and the documents. I'm not really answering the question, but I suppose, poets, I'm going back to ethics. I sound like a lawyer tonight, but I do think we are not under the same obligations as a memoirist. We don't have, you know, what Philip Lejeune calls the autobiographical pact, the idea that whatever you write down is going to be, you know, the truth as far as you can recall it. Poetry, readers want to be invested in the idea of truth in poetry, but they can't expect it. And, you know, time and time again, I've heard poets say something like about finding the emotional truth as opposed to the documentary truth. That's always been more important to me than the documentary truth, especially when that truth hasn't been available to me, but it's grounded in research often. And I think, Shirley, did you mention, I think it was, you said, tell the truth, but tell it slant. I thought you said something along, you know, some phrasing of that. And that's what I think as well from Emily Dickinson.
I prefer Marianne Moe's real toads in imaginary gardens.
Okay. So I'm thinking of Emily Dickinson, tell the truth, but tell it slant. Sometimes the truth is not as interesting as what you might do in a poem. Just throwing that out there. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I think we probably better finish there, but I'd just like to thank everybody again.
Thank you.
And especially as I know everyone's incredibly busy, but I've really enjoyed it and I'm going to read more, and I hope everyone who's listening is going to go and buy the books and also savor the words of these poets. Thank you.